You guys, I'm really trying. I've filmed this like 20 times. I'm trying. Ugh.
Back away. Yeah.
Good afternoon, guys. My name is Ashley, and I am here to talk to you about things that scare me. So I've put a little thought into what I wanted to talk about and truly base it off of things I have always found scary. And what I've decided to talk about, let me do my little disclaimer first, is it is made my stomach turn. And I watch and listen to a lot of eerie stories, and I feel like I've pretty much heard all the mainstream ones, and this one turns my stomach. Now, that's your disclaimer, just so you know. But also I want you to know that the research and the information I'm providing you is all things I've done at home at my computer. Please feel free to do your own research on this topic. Also, I wanted to take a second to say thank you to the lovely constructive criticism that I'm a bad storyteller. I honestly agree. I am working at this, and I'm working at the editing. It's important to me to get better at it, and it's just one step at a time, and I'm not gonna give up or quit. I say that lightheartedly and almost joking. I appreciate the time to watch the video. I do appreciate constructive criticism. It's helpful. And I appreciate likes and subscribes as well. So that's what's gonna keep me going. Today I wanted to talk about the movie Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but I'm actually not gonna focus on just that today. What I want to actually talk about is what inspired the movie. It wasn't just one thing that inspired this film. There was actually several different characters. So I'm going to divide that up into two videos. Today I'm going to start with honestly one of my, when I say favorite, it's not a favorite. It's a person I find incredibly fascinating and disturbing. And he, like I said, he scares me, but it is very fascinating to hear about. And then I will also, next time I have a video, talk about another person that inspired this movie. And then I plan to wrap this little 3-part up with some things about the movie Texas Chainsaw Massacre just in general. Speaking of, I have my Halloween Horror Nights Universal Studios. I was talking about that in one of my videos. This is one of the glasses I got there. Again, this is my favorite scary movie. Now, there are a ton of Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies out there, a ton. Remakes, spin-offs. The Jessica Biel one, I loved that movie. But I'm actually focusing mostly on the Tobe Hooper 1974 release of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and what inspired him to make the character Leatherface. So if you haven't seen the movie, spoiler alert, Leatherface is one of the main, most beloved and infamous monsters of Hollywood, if you will. Leatherface wasn't born just because someone dreamt him up. Leatherface is actually inspired by several different infamous people throughout history. And today we're going to focus on one of those people, which is Eddie Gein. So Eddie Gein was born August 27th, 1906 in Wisconsin. Now he was born to George and Augustus Gein, and he had an older brother named Henry. His father is described as being, not described, there's just one word. His father was an alcoholic, and then his mother was, you know who I thought of, and this is again me loving scary movies. From the movie Carrie, her mother reminds me a lot of Eddie Gein's mother, Augustus. She was very controlling and wanted both her boys to be very sheltered from the world, and that's how they were raised. She wanted them to basically think that women and, I don't know, SUX, sins that involved women and the way that the thoughts they gave men, she wanted her boys to just think that was plain out evil. And she didn't want them hanging around with anyone from school or anywhere. They weren't involved in any groups because she didn't want them to be influenced by outside sources. So basically the only time these boys left their home was when they were headed off to school, and then they were straight back home to work on this farm in Plainville, Wisconsin. Both boys were a bit different, even though they were raised in the same house. Henry, Ed's older brother, for lack of better words, it seemed as if he resented his mother and the upbringing he was having. He wanted to be more social. He wanted to go out and do things. Whereas Ed thought his mother walked on water and really didn't like that his brother would put her down in any sort of way. Ed's father passed away in 1940, leaving just Ed, Henry, and his mother Augustus to live on the farm and work the farmland. So once Ed's father had passed, Henry really, I think he just had really had it with his mother and her way of life, and constantly making the boys feel guilty for any sort of thing outside of what she deemed holy, for what it's worth. Henry would belittle his mother to Ed. And Ed, thinking his mother walked on water, he thought what she said went. He worshiped his mother. She was everything to him. When Henry was belittling their mother, Ed kind of got fed up with it. Now, this is going to come back to maybe play into this, and maybe not. So in 1944, just 4 years after Ed's father had passed away, a brush fire broke out on their farm, and Ed and Henry went to put out this fire. The boys were separated, and come nightfall, Ed came back to the farm and he couldn't find his brother. After some searching, they ended up finding Henry was deceased, and while he'd had some bruises on the back of his head, which is like, where did those come from? When they took his body in, the coroner had ruled it asphyxiation from the smoke from the fire. That was always just thought to be the case. But whenever all this stuff comes back around, they've now kind of thought, was it asphyxiation or what were those bruises from on the back of his head? After learning all the things that Ed Gein goes on to do. So, moving on. Now that Henry has deceased, just Ed and his mother Augustus are living on the farm. And they go on living just the two of them until just a year later in 1945 when Augustus passes away. He was definitely devastated, very, very sad. His mother was all he knew. She's all he had. And he just didn't have any other friends. Now, he knew people around town and they kind of knew him as a quiet, gentle guy, but he didn't hang out with these people. He was secluded on his farm. That said, with his mother gone, Ed was able to dive into a couple things that he never did when his mother was alive. And some of those things he would read or look at adult magazines. You know what I'm talking about. He also read cult magazines. He read stories of cannibalism, and he also was reading stories on Nazi atrocities. So some very, very wicked stuff that were really giving him ideas. And then you have to keep in mind that while he loved his mother and was obsessed with his mother, he didn't like women. So I think he was just internally conflicted, again, just my opinion, very internally conflicted on what to do with the world around him. He no longer had his mother to tell him how to live and what to do. But now he had this inner turmoil of the most important person in his life was his mother, a woman. And then she had taught him to hate women. So he was in a rough spot, guys. So 12 years pass and Ed's been living on his own. The year's 1957, and like I was explaining, he was a lonely guy in town, very quiet, seemed harmless to everybody, seemed very simple to everyone. No one really thought too much of him until 1957. On November 16th, 1957, Ed visits a hardware store, and working in that store is Bernice Warden. Now, several hours of Ed visiting the store where Bernice was working, she was reported missing. So what the local authorities did, they went through her receipts and had found a receipt to Ed and decided they would kind of work backwards and see if maybe he had noticed anything when he was in there, being the last customer. They really didn't think a lot of it just yet, but they did think, it's a good place to start. He was the last person to possibly see her alive or know her whereabouts or whatever's happened to her. But when arriving on the Gein farm, the investigators went ahead and looked around, and one of the first things they investigated was the shed. Now, when they went into the shed, it was said to be dark and they had flashlights, and one of the investigators walked in, backed up, and bumped into something. And he kind of, with his flashlight, decided to turn around and see what he bumped into. It was Bernice's body, and it was strung up almost like you would skin a deer. And they literally ran out of the shed terrified. That is not what they expected to find. They were scared. They were very scared. I'd have been scared. Once they finally were able to investigate her body, they did discover that Bernice was shot with a rifle, and then he had mutilated her body after she was deceased. With finding Bernice, this started a whole unraveling of all of Ed's, the past 12 years since his mother had deceased, all of his extracurricular activities isn't the right word for it, but what he was doing behind closed doors. So now the little kind guy, quiet man from the town is incredibly terrifying. This is the part that really turned my stomach, as opposed to all of it just bothering me. But obviously, with finding Bernice's body, the investigators then decided they were going to inspect all of the Gein farm property. Some of the items they found were skulls, human skulls, hollowed out, made into bowls that he would use. There was a coffee table that he used shin bones as the legs of the coffee table. There were lampshades and upholstered furniture made out of skin. There was, I'm not even listing all the things there were. There was a jar of noses, human noses. There was a belt made out of all of these things, and everything is just disturbing. But the thing that I found the most disturbing, and kind of where some of this inspiration for that Leatherface from the movie Texas Chainsaw Massacre gets some of his inspiration, is Ed had taken flesh from a female's body and made a suit. So picture it what you will. He'd made a suit out of the flesh, and then he had taken a woman's face and skinned it and used the skin and made a mask. And he would even put in, there wasn't just one mask, he had a bunch of masks. Some were used as decoration, but he would wear this mask or these masks, and he would even put lipstick on it. Which, speaking of, I know I'm talking about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but if you've seen Silence of the Lambs with Anthony Hopkins and you know who Buffalo Bill is, definitely he is also based off of Gein's history. Investigators were horrified. They didn't know if they had a serial killer on their hands. That's what they assumed. They found all these body parts and everything, and they were just like, oh my gosh, when did this happen? Now, other than Bernice Warden, he did also take the life of a woman named Mary Hogan. Mary Hogan owned a local tavern, and investigators believed and psychologists believed that Mary Hogan reminded Ed of his mother, and that's why he wanted her. And so he did take her life one evening when she was working at her tavern. Now, investigators never had figured this out until they stumbled across the horrors of his farm, but they did find her body there, and they were able to solve that missing persons case, which had happened 3 years prior to 1957 when Bernice disappeared. These two women, they are actually the only people who Ed did take the lives of. Now, there is the brother in question. Like I said, once they learned about all this stuff, it kind of raised some red flags. Like, you know, should we have looked into his brother's death more? Did we miss something? Why did he have the bruises on the back of his head? But ultimately, as far as history shows, 2 women were murdered. Now, where did all these body parts come from? How did he make a belt out of women's? Now, this was actually because he would visit the local cemetery and dug up different bodies over the course of those 12 years between when his mother had passed and when he was caught. What Ed said he would do is he would watch the obituaries to see who had passed, and then that's how he would know when he would want or who he would want to visit their grave, and which I think is just the most sickening, disrespectful. I cannot imagine how I would feel if I had found out someone I loved, I had put them to rest, and someone decided to undo that. He was asked if he did ever have with these bodies, and Ed said no, because they smelt too bad, which I just think that was the hang up. There wasn't 100 other things before that, but that's what he said. Once arrested, Ed Gein obviously was going to stand trial. Now, unfortunately, he did, but he didn't. He was deemed mentally unstable and actually didn't ever go to trial. He was sent to Central State Hospital in Wisconsin, but was later transferred to the Mendota State Hospital, which is also in Wisconsin. Now, years later, in 1968, doctors did actually deem him fit to stand trial. However, with that said, Judge Golmer, when the doctors deemed him fit, found him actually not guilty by reason of mental insanity. Ed did spend the rest of his life in the Mendota State Hospital. Ed would die at the age of 77 while still in the Mendota State Hospital due to lung cancer. Gein still lives on in our dark American history and has truly fascinated me since I learned about him in high school. You watch the movie The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and it says based on true events. I wanted to know why, and I looked it up, and that's how I first discovered Ed Gein. As I mentioned before, this is going to be a 3-part, but I really wanted you to understand some of the pull to who made Leatherface what he was when Tobe Hooper created him for the movie Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I do totally recommend this movie, by the way. Maybe you can watch, if you've already seen it, maybe watch all 3 of these videos and then you can go back and get aha moments. I do appreciate your time more than you guys will even ever know. I am really enjoying getting to do this, and honestly, I find this dark history so fascinating. As always, you are so appreciated. Please be kind with your comments below. I do appreciate the feedback, and constructive criticism is beyond welcome. Please take the time to like and subscribe to my channel, and I'm gonna do part 2 hopefully later this week or next week. Due to lung cancer and complications with that, period. Why did I say period? Oh my God, I'm so ridiculous.